Welcome back to the Mom and Mind podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kat. On our episode today, we are joined by Christine Carrig. She is the founding director of Carrig Montessori School in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. And she's been a Montessori teacher and administrator with a focus on early childhood education for nearly 2 decades. She's the writer in residence for CORA, Maternal and Reproductive Psychology Lab at Teachers College, Columbia University, where she focuses her writing on the intersection between child development and maternal development in the hopes of bringing a more holistic view to the parent-child dyad. And we are going to get into some of that today. She talks about matrescence, the development into motherhood, which is really such an important discussion that we've been having more and more on this podcast as a concept for understanding what it's like, what goes on for people when they are transitioning into the role of mother or parent. And she's sharing specifically her understanding and concept of how a mother's matrescence may impact child development. And we get into a conversation that I love and I've been thinking a lot about, really wanting to have, is how some of the parenting strategies out there, like gentle parenting or others that are like that, um, put some pressure on parents. And my perspective is that if there is a parenting paradigm, a parenting strategy that does not include the consideration of what the parent is going through, then it's an incomplete perspective on how to parent. There's so much going on for all of us who are, trying to parent through our own healing and the pressure that we feel for so many reasons, social media included, on, what kind of parent we're supposed to be and how bad we should feel if we're not meeting that standard. It's just too much. So I'm happy to have that conversation with her. And she was on the podcast a couple of years ago sharing her own story. Now that she's had some distance from that time, she's able to also reflect on her own path and her own journey. So I'm real excited for you to hear this episode. Let's meet Christine. All right. Welcome, Christine. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, well, thanks for coming back. And I'm really excited to hear about your perspective today, especially since it's been a little bit since you were on the podcast the first time. You've had some time away, or I guess healed from or healing from stuff you went through. So, yeah, I'm really happy to have you here and to talk about how you got to this point in the work that you do.
Yeah, I'm so excited to talk about where things have come since last time. I know last time we talked, I was very much kind of just beginning to turn the lens back on my experience of having, gone through having these 4 children of my own, and it was very much a personal experience. And since that time, I've kind of found my way into the study of matrescence. I ended up taking a class with Dr. Arlie Athan up at Teachers College at Columbia University, and she actually runs the CORA Maternal and Reproductive Psychology Lab at Teachers College, Columbia University. And the whole field of study with this idea of matrescence and putting a developmental lens on this passage into motherhood resonated with me so much, probably in part because my work with early childhood development is a developmental lens. And so having a similar lens to view the transition to motherhood through was amazing to me. So done a lot of study there, and I'm doing a little bit of writing with their lab and just connecting more and more dots as I go along. So I'm excited to have that conversation with you today.
Yeah. So that's awesome. And for people who are just getting familiar or hearing about the word matrescence, what is that? And can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah. So I want to give Dr. Athan's definition because she really says it best. So it's defined as a developmental process of becoming a mother. So the transition from non-mother to mother, or from being a mom of one kid to more. And the changes are holistic, meaning they happen across all the areas in life that make us human. So bio, psycho, relational, social, economic, existential, ecological, spiritual, all of those domains get shifted in pretty seismic ways when
Mm-hmm.
we enter that passage into motherhood, not just the first time, but
Mm-hmm.
each time.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, it's so important to have that lens, and I know that more and more people are really talking about it and um, trying to help people understand their transition into parenthood through that lens. Um, because I think it does a couple of things. One, it's not just like, oh yeah, well, everybody's doing it, so you should be fine. Kind of the idea behind motherhood is that it happens, so it shouldn't be a big
Mm-hmm.
deal.
Yeah, it's ubiquitous. So what are we
Mhm.
talking about? Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But putting it in the developmental lens and frame that you are changing as a human is really powerful.
And the way that Dr. Athan talks about it is think of matrescence like adolescence. One, it helps you pronounce it. And then
Mhm.
two, if we all think back to adolescence, we have a visceral feeling of
Mhm.
how many how many changes we went through in adolescence. It changed our peer group, it changed our identity. We had physical changes, we
Oh
had
yeah.
psychological changes.
Mhm.
And while it's a time of heightened and rapid development, it's also a prime time for vulnerability.
For
And if
sure.
we think back to our adolescence, we can have a felt sense of that. And so that's what's very much going on in matrescence
Yeah.
too.
Yeah, absolutely. So how does, I mean, you tell us a little bit about the early childhood training and education you do, or training you have in education you do.
Yes. So my master's is actually in early childhood education, and I am a Montessori. Well, I say Montessori teacher because that's actually in my heart. I'm always Montessori teacher, but I run a Montessori school, Carrig Montessori in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and uh, I've been in early childhood education and very specifically in Montessori education for almost 2 decades now, and so that's really what I do day in and day out. I'm primarily with 3 to 6 year olds, although very exciting for us as a school. We're expanding into elementary, so I've got some first graders this year who
Nice.
are the highlight of my day every day over here. But I've worked in the early childhood side of things. And then since becoming a mother, I thought I was going to be very focused on my children's development. And I was, but I was also like, well, what about me?
Hmm.
I'm going through something here. And what is this that I'm trying to track in myself that I have no language for? And
Right.
so I had been fascinated with child development for, again, almost 2 decades. And then I really did wonder upon becoming a mother, if we know this much about child development, why are we not talking about this development that mothers are going through? Because I could feel it as that.
Right.
There were shifts that were so seismic that I knew my brain was changing.
Hmm.
And I wanted a way to kind of make sense of that for myself. Um, so yeah, the connections between my work in early childhood and matrescence have kind of, for me, felt really big because there are a lot of overlaps in that. Parts of early childhood development are really messy, but they
Hmm.
don't need to be fixed. That's just what they are.
Hmm.
And parts of maternal development can be really messy, um, but they don't necessarily need fixing. They need support,
Hmm.
just like we think of for toddlers. That tantrum needs support. Does it need fixing? Does it need to stop? No, it just needs, those
Yep.
compassionate eyes.
Hmm. Whew, I think we should just sit with that for a minute. Because that is definitely not how we think, or the framework for, I guess, the more conventional framework is that the that moms sort of either do need to be fixed or that they should be, I don't know. I don't even know what all is in there. There's just so much in what you said that we can just allow support, but it is what is. People are going through a
Hmm.
process, and most people feel like they need to be fixed, like there's something wrong with them.
Yep.
That
Yep.
sucks. Like that just can't,
Yes.
that's not okay.
Right. And obviously, and you know, we should say this, of course, especially on this podcast, there are times where there does need to be targeted support, right? Like sometimes we need
Mhm.
medication.
Sure.
Um, Therapy is a wonderful thing. There are times when, yes, we're going to fall into a category where there's a diagnosis. But if we think about statistics around maternal mental health, if we have, let's say, you would know better than I, but 20% of mothers being diagnosed with a perinatal mood disorder,
Mhm.
the 80%, they're not sailing through
Right.
um, in the same way that, 4-year-olds are not sailing through life
Right, right.
all the time either. It's hugely challenging to go through a phase of life where you're in an acute stage of development, like early childhood, like adolescence, like matrescence.
Mhm.
There, there's just a lot going on there, and there's a lot that we need to come alongside and recognize and validate without trying to say this is this is not a normative experience, because a lot of it is, even though it's pretty uncomfortable and messy.
For sure. Oh, that's so important. So in your process in learning through all of this, how has it shaped how you see how your journey was at that time?
Oh, I mean, it's been so useful in kind of synthesizing a lot of what I was looking at and the way I was looking at things. So I had my, that I have 4 kids. And so I had my first child, and I had been highly focused on the birth going into it, which I think a lot of new mothers are. That's like the thing you can kind of glom onto, like
Mhm.
this birth process. Little did I know that uh, the physical changes were going to be lasting afterwards. I mean, that I was really floored by the postpartum physical recovery, even though I had a pretty, as on the in the grand scheme of things, I had a pretty smooth birth. Um, the postpartum recovery was really difficult for me, and no one talked to me about that. No one gave me any heads up about what that would be like,
Mhm.
and and then I also became highly concerned about, is there healthy attachment in this relationship, and going
Mhm.
down some rabbit holes that I think are really common in the way of like looking at Dr. Sears and like the 7 B's of baby bonding, and kind of looking at the behavior that would
Mhm.
indicate attachment, rather than truly understanding that that's someone boiling it down to the most simplistic and measurable terms, but that's not the crux of what healthy attachment is. And
Mhm.
if you want to read about that, Bethany Saltman's book, Strange Situation, does an amazing job of diving into the science of attachment in a really holistic way. Um, but I was kind of looking at it through those two lenses the first time around, right? Like the physical postpartum recovery, um, and that was before Kimberly Young Johnson's The Fourth Trimester was out. Like that wasn't even available when I had
Mhm.
my first child. I was looking at attachment, kind of being really self-punishing about how I was looking at that too, which
Mhm.
I think it's not uncommon from what I see with the parents that I work with.
Nope.
Um,
Yeah, I'd like to get into that in a moment with you.
yes,
But yeah.
absolutely. I would love to get into that. And then, my second child, I very likely had an untreated I very likely had untreated postpartum depression with
Mm.
him. And so then I was looking at everything through the lens of maternal mental health. All of these things were really useful. But then I had my third baby and my fourth, and I was like, wait a second, this is not my first rodeo. And I'm still going through incredibly huge shifts with each child that I have. And so
Mhm.
what is going on here? And when we spoke last, I was able to I had enough distance to be able to talk about how I had finally kind of befriended hypervigilance, right? Like I knew that that was going to rear its head in those early
Mhm.
postpartum months after each baby I had. And I was just like, all right, yep, that's that. That's kind of part of the game. I knew that was coming. But having this way of looking at each of those experiences through the lens of matrescence has been like, well, of course you had these profound experiences. And perhaps one of the domains that we talked about at the beginning when we talked about the definition, psychological, physical, social, one of those domains might have risen to the top with each experience that I had after giving birth. But the lens of matrescence has kind of shown that like they're all important, and one might be the most profound for you. In the same way with adolescence,
Right.
you know, sometimes it's the physical changes that were the most profound. Sometimes it's the social changes. Sometimes your identity kind of coming into a new way and how you're seen in society is the most profound change. But so I kind of think of it in terms of, if you think about that parable of like the six blind men and the elephant, and they're each like touching a different part of the elephant and trying to describe to one another like what they've come across. And someone's touching the side, and someone's touching the tusk, and someone's touching the tail. And in some versions of that parable, like they actually end up fighting because they think that they're being dishonest with one another. But the idea is that no one's wrong in the way we're looking at mothers, right? You could look at it through the lens of maternal mental health. You could look at it through the lens of physical recovery and postpartum time. You could look at it through a nervous system lens. You could look at it through an attachment lens. These are all ways to look at it. Matrescence kind of like gives that full picture of the elephant to me in a lot of ways. It's pulling all of those pieces together and really showing us the whole deal.
Oh, that is so great. And such a useful way to think about it too. I think in this day and age with I don't know what it is, but like, on social media, people are in a position to have to sort of like prove a point or be right or whatever that is. And your points about how like these different guys are touching different parts of the elephant and they can all be right, but the sort of social media version of that is arguments or disagreements, and looking at it through this lens that we can all have perspective is so useful. Especially for and maybe this is where we'll get into some of the juicy bits here, is what ends up happening on social media, or how people hear about how they're supposed to be as a mother or how they're supposed to be as a parent, is that as if one person is right and the other person's wrong. And so people are defending their positions and not knowing that it can all be true. All of it can be true.
That's right. That's right. All of it can be true. And usually all of it is true, at least parts of it. But we are in this, and you hit the nail on the head, we kind of are in this time where if we're looking at content on social media and these small snippets that are attention grabby, certitudes have come to rule the day. And motherhood is not really about certitudes. It's about a lot of nuance. And we kind of have to respect that the experience is so broad and at the same time so profound that a lot has to be true all at once. And it doesn't mean they need to be in conflict with one another. And where I see this and my interest in writing for the lab, even though my background is in early childhood, is in looking at the parent-child dyad, where in some ways we've almost split the parent-child dyad down the middle. And we've said, this side is important, the child. The mother is, rendered invisible if everything is going well with the child. And if something is not going well with the child, she's turned into the scapegoat in many ways.
Yes.
And that's not a great way to look at the parent-child dyad.
No.
Because if the development of the child is yoked to the development of the mother, which in many ways we know it to be, then how are we not supporting the whole thing? And why are we splitting it off into this either or, way that we have been doing? And the reason we're doing that is because there's certitude in that, right? It's this takes priority. This is going to kind of take a back seat. And there's a lot of nuance in negotiating what's good for the child and what's good for the mother at the same time, because sometimes those two things are in conflict. If we're thinking about how I mean, let's just pick a really hot topic so we can try to make a point. But if we're thinking about sleep training,
Mhm.
the mother needs sleep. The
Mhm.
baby needs to be fed. These
Mhm.
are two important biological needs that are going
Right.
on, and they're in conflict at
Right.
times. And so there's not necessarily going to be one right answer to that. And I'm not going to open that can of worms except to appreciate how complex that is. And it's extremely complex. And
Yep.
so someone could say sleep training is the right way to go. Another person could say that's absolute child abuse. Maybe we can find that depending on which way you're looking at that, there could be threads of truth in both, but there's judgment in both. And that's what we can kind of step away from and say that we both need to be supported in their development. And so a baby being fed and a mother sleeping, those are both hugely important things. And how do we negotiate that? That's where that nuance comes in. And that's,
Mhm.
you can't boil that down to um, an Instagram post necessarily.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
Absolutely not. And because, there's just this like short exposure to just like one or two sentences of a whole concept or a whole understanding. I'm thinking just specifically like people scrolling through stuff and getting these sound bites. What happens, what I see on my end is the mother or the parent or the dad sees this a bit of information, thinks because maybe the person's sounding authoritative, or
Hmm.
maybe they are an expert, but they're only hearing like one sentence of something and it's absorbed almost immediately because there's some idea that, like, if somebody's already sitting there vulnerable, they're in pregnancy or postpartum, and they're not sure what they're doing, and somebody else comes in saying this is what you're supposed to do, well, then you're more likely to think, yes, that's what I'm supposed to do. And then if you don't have the support to do it, or if you can't do it for whatever reasons, biological or otherwise, then you just sit there with shame and you feel bad. You don't
Yes.
think to yourself, well, I mean, I only have one point of this whole big concept, so maybe there's more to the story. That's not how our brains work in those moments. We feel the emotional pang of the shame or embarrassment or whatever it is,
Hmm.
and it gets internalized, and we feel, okay, well, that's what I'm supposed to do for my child. So I'm going to set aside everything else that I need and just do that one thing that might not even fit into your life or lifestyle.
Yep. Exactly. Yeah. The willingness to kind of have this like emotional self erasure in parenthood just has to stop, because we can't raise healthy kids if we're trying to eclipse our experience for the benefit of our child. It's just not sustainable. And if we think about, I just keep having opportunities to loop back to this, but if we think about matrescence like adolescence, we have research now that says social media can be extremely harmful in adolescence. And so if the brain is doing similar things in matrescence as it's doing in adolescence, we're once again highly susceptible to
Mhm.
suggestion on
Mhm.
social media during that
Mhm.
time. And there are people who, um, you know, not necessarily through overt malintent, but on some level they know that this is a vulnerable population, and if they have something to sell, if they're selling this idea of, this is the right way to parent, and they
Mhm.
have a vulnerable parent coming to them for that content, uh, they can buy it hook, line, and sinker. And it goes further into this idea that in years past, well before social media, uh, parenting, the idea of parenting, like that was passed down generationally. We had intergenerational contact, and that's how we were learning how to raise our children.
Mhm.
And the people who were supporting us in our parenting experience were people who were highly invested in that family's cultural values being,
Mhm.
perpetuated.
Mhm.
Now we've divorced parental advice from any lineage, and so it's just coming from like wherever, it's the Wild West.
Right.
And
True.
people are looking outwardly to all these different places, and it's extremely overwhelming. And
Yeah.
they're drawn to the certitude and the exactness, and like this is the right way. And as you said, um, someone who feels authoritative to them. rather than someone who's willing to kind of sit in the, well, it could be this or it could be this. It just
Mhm.
depends. And
Yeah.
so often in parenting and in motherhood, that's the case, you know. In one sense, it could be right for you to lose another night of sleep and get up and feed the baby. In another sense, if you're in a highly fragile state, you have to prioritize your sleep or the
Mhm.
whole house of cards is coming down.
Yeah, absolutely. Are you seeing this? I mean, you're seeing kids from, how early of an age are kids coming to your, um,
We see
school?
them. So sometimes we have our mindful parenting program running, which is like the little ones,
Mhm.
the babies and the toddlers. And that's a really nice container because it has a parent discussion
Mhm.
component to it
Mhm.
as well. And so we're getting to see the children, then we're getting to see the parents. And so sometimes I'm seeing them as early as 10 months. But as far as who's coming to school every day and the parents I'm most interacting with, it's as early as 3.
Mhm. Yeah.
And
Are you
it's
seeing this stuff, sort of like, I guess, play out in a sense? Meaning like, how do you think this lack of honoring the matrescence part of stuff shows up for parents that you, interact with?
it's 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 challenging because we're here in support of the child's development, right, as the school. And parents are trying to be so much in support of whatever is best for their child. But we also see that parents are extending themselves so much for the benefit of their child that sometimes they're not coming back to their own home base to say, like, but what am I going through right now? And
Mhm.
this is particularly heightened if a child is having a challenge in whatever area, you know.
Mm.
Um, if the child is having a challenge, it very often what we're wanting to do as a school is look at the whole picture and say, hey, we're noticing this. Is there anything going on at home that we should know about? Because what we see is um, maybe other areas need support. The
Yeah.
child doesn't need fixing. Again, I'm so much of this idea that there's nothing that needs fixing here, but we see something that's a bit different. And so can we get some context? And sometimes the context is that no one at home is sleeping
Mm.
because they have another baby at home. And so there's chronic sleep deprivation going on. I know with my kids, um, I was hugely dysregulated for long periods of time because I was always getting up with, the next baby. And then my older kids were like, what's wrong with mom? Well, I just wasn't sleeping, but they didn't have any context for that.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so the priorities in our house would need to shift occasionally. Like I had to get some sleep so I could be more regulated. And so how were we going to brainstorm that? And so with parents and the parents that I talk to who are just so completely well intentioned, as are all parents, for the most part, they're just wanting to do more for
Mhm.
their child,
Mhm.
and the empathetic tilt is all leaning in favor of the child. And what I'm wanting to do and persuade them to do again and again is like put some of that empathy back on yourself, and the
Mhm.
whole picture will kind of reorganize.
Mhm.
Um, but there's
It's
not the impulse to do that.
Oh, no, no, no. I mean, as you're talking through this, I'm thinking of, gosh, so many, scenarios where I hear the client I'm talking about in my own private practice, like clients who are coming in, moms, who are influenced by social media, on things like sleep training or things like gentle parenting, where they feel, maybe because they're only getting sound bites. I'll take gentle parenting, for instance, because I have a certain,
Hmm. Please do.
soapbox about it.
I have thoughts.
Yeah, let's go. Let's go. Um, it actually is one of the things that drives me the most crazy, when I'm listening to, a mom who feels such a drive to want to do all of the gentle parenting things.
Hmm.
And that is
Hmm.
if they've only heard something on social media, or even if they've, like, read all the books. Um, there's this pressure to do it, just right. And if they don't, then they're not being a good parent. it comes
Mm-hmm.
back on. I hear it all the time. I'm a failure. I'm a bad mom. All of these horrible things that people feel
Mm-hmm.
about themselves. And I guess my opinion is that because of what I see, is that if there's a prescribed way of parenting that does not include the development of the parent, then it is an incomplete
Yes.
model of parenting.
Yes.
It's missing a
That's
whole lot.
that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And when we think about gentle parenting, and actually I just wrote an article, not for the lab, just my own soapbox. I just wrote an article that appeared in Insider about this idea that gentle parenting, while perhaps best practice taken in a vacuum for just the child, is really eclipsing the parent. And it's creating something that's completely unsustainable
Yes.
for the parent.
Yes.
Uh, and in some cases, it's so it's doing two things as far as what I see it doing and the way I see it playing out. It's creating an emotional restriction for the parent that's unnatural,
Mm-hmm.
and it's creating a complete lack of container for the child
Mm-hmm.
in some instances.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when it's taken to extremes. And if you
Sure.
look at, you know, the way attachment kind of got butchered in popular culture. It's like we took away this idea that mutual delight was part of attachment, and
Mm-hmm.
instead we boiled it down to these behaviors. Gentle parenting very likely was based on something that had a lot more um, nuance to it, but the
Mm-hmm.
way it's being put into practice, and
Mm-hmm.
going back to your point of these like,
Mm-hmm.
little snippets that people are getting on social media where they're just hooking into one idea of a behavior that's replicable and not thinking about the internal intention of that practice,
Mm-hmm.
or how grounded you have to be to do that practice
Yes.
effectively. um, they're trying to do the behaviors overlaid on top of a dysregulated nervous system.
Yes.
And your
Absolutely.
child is not going to be soothed if you're internally dysregulated and trying to speak all of this, gentleness toward them as they're tantruming. Like it's not going to be effective, and
Mm-hmm.
it's not authentic. And
Mm-hmm.
so some of the ways that, like what you said, if the parent isn't included in a parenting technique, their development is not being considered, if their internal experience is not being considered,
Mm-hmm.
it's not a complete or sustainable practice.
No.
Uh, because even maternal ambivalence, and Barbara Almond writes about this, the idea of, and some people think ambivalence is like apathy, but it's the two valences, right? The
Mm-hmm.
extreme, like the loving and hating feelings, that has its own function
Mm-hmm.
in parenting. Like if we can't honor that sometimes we are past our limit, and that
Yes.
means that we have to set a boundary,
Yep.
and that boundary has to be set with a little bit of now I'm talking about all these people who've come before us who've given us this great language for this, but Lisa Marciano, who writes Motherhood, with some aggressive capacity, which
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean we're aggressing toward our child, but that we have like an internal aggressive capacity to set a
Mm-hmm.
boundary.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to be past our threshold all the time in
Yep.
parenting,
Yep.
because it's a child's job to push and feel out the boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to really hit our internal limit and allow ourselves to honor what wells up inside us, to be able to
Mm-hmm.
say, nope, that's a no-go with me right
Right.
now.
Yeah.
And if we're accepting everything that the child is cueing for, we're kind of losing ourselves in that process, which is never the way it was intended to be.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a healthy version of the parent-child dyad.
Yeah. This is so rich and so important because it just plays out so much all throughout the development of the child and mother. I mean, even during pregnancy, it already starts, sometimes
Yes.
even before that, um, of this idea of who you are as a as a parent forms way before you have kids. But
Mm-hmm.
especially during that period where you're working towards becoming a parent, or you're in pregnancy, or in postpartum, you're self-forming your ideas for in all kinds of ways about what kind of parent you want to be, while um sometimes, and this is where I really really get frustrated with how restricting social media is for people. If you, as a parent, let's say you had a really rough childhood and your goal is
Mhm.
to be a different kind of a parent, you want to provide something different for your kids, great. And if gentle parenting is a guidepost for you, or there are things within different parenting styles that you're hearing about that are useful to you, cool, use those. You're trying to learn a
Mhm.
different thing. However, if you can't, if there's no healing of your own hurt from your own past, and you're expecting yourself to be something you've never seen before as a parent, it's how can I say, like, it's not a trap, but it's a setup. If
Mhm.
you feel like you have to be this whatever it is, this idealized version of parent, maybe how you wanted to be, how you wanted your parents to be, but you haven't had that healing, it is so much harder to do
Mhm.
parenting in the way that you want to, because there's still so much pain internally. And that is, I mean, I could go on and on about this. That's not even considering whatever context your life is in. Maybe like you
Right.
just had a kid, but your own parent passed away. Or
Mhm.
maybe your spouse or partner just lost their job. Like there's no, the context has to be a part of it. And that's both current time context and where you've come from or what you're trying to heal from. It's nearly impossible to put that standard on yourself of being in this perfect parenting mode all the time while like the world is burning down around you.
Yes. Yes, exactly. It's like trying to give from an empty well. Like you
Mhm.
just can't do it. You have to kind of fill that up first, and then you can think about turning around and providing that from a really authentic place for your child.
Mhm.
And it's so much when I came on your show the first time, it's so much the experience that I had gone through when I had my first child, and then as you said, like the things were kind of burning down around me when I had my second. There were a lot of events that took place, kind of one after another in a very tight period of time,
Mhm.
all before my second child was like 1 month old. And it really affected my older child.
Mhm.
And the idea there was not to try to fix her, but to try to really sort out, to stop all the fires basically.
Yeah.
And I couldn't keep pouring all my energy into only her. I had to give some back to myself
Mhm.
in order for us to have a sustainable relationship that was going to be healthy for the both of us.
Right.
Um, and so, yeah, that it's not the culture that we're raising children in right now does not make it easy for mothers to turn energy back onto themselves. It's
Totally.
it's very much the idea is that you give and give and give, and we're looking to optimize, our child's development, and we can do that if we focus solely on the child. That's not the full picture. And if we go back, in the 17th and 18th century, we have this idea that mothers' internal thoughts in pregnancy could cause like blindness or mental illness for their child, really, really insane things, where we've been putting stuff on
Yeah.
mothers for centuries.
True,
And
true.
then you look back even to last century, and we have this idea of refrigerator mothers causing autism in children, which, like, that wasn't that long ago. That was like in the 1940s and 50s. And that whole theory was not debunked until the 70s. And so,
That's
really, really
crazy.
recently, we're talking about scapegoating mothers for just their way of being or their internal life, even like their thoughts.
Mhm.
Um, like, 17th, 18th, 19th century, their thoughts, 20th century, their actions, right? Being
Mhm.
cold. And now it's like the field of child development, which has done amazing things for us understanding the internal world of children. It it's also been a one-sided look at the child's experience,
Yes.
and the mothers are again kind of rendered almost like this nuisance factor, if you really look at that. And so we're trying to move in the right direction, but it's gotten very child centric. And so
Mm-hmm.
this idea of having an entire field of study devoted to maternal development under this umbrella of matrescence is huge, because if we can have mothers come alongside their own development
Mm-hmm.
in tandem to coming alongside their child's development, this is hugely powerful for
Yes.
the mothers that are, being born into their motherhood right now, and it's
Mm-hmm.
hugely powerful for the next generation of children who get to see that their mothers valued themselves and their own experience as well as
Mm-hmm.
their child, and that both can be done. And it's the messier version, right? It's not the quick certitude of like,
Mm-hmm.
do this, you'll get that result, but it can be done in a way that is supportive to both.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think it has to be that way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it, it, I mean, this is a system. The, each of the dyads or the whole family, each has their own, a system. And if you're just taking one huge part of that out and just asking them to be a robot, like it's not going to work.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to work.
Mm-hmm.
It's too
Yeah.
short-sighted, and it's too incomplete.
Yeah, a very compassionate robot with so many snacks.
Oh my gosh, I just thought of the Jetsons. It's a really old cartoon, but
Yep. No, I'm
Rosie
right
was
there
a
with
good
you.
robot. Mhm.
Yes, that's
Uh,
right. We can't all live up to that standard.
no, no. But like I love this discussion. And I think there's so much more that both of us could say about it, especially in terms of soapbox frustrations with how you see it impacting the folks that you work with, and me too, that on the just
Mm-hmm.
strictly on the mental health side of the mother. But outside of that, is there anything you'd like to wrap us up on?
I guess just, it's just bringing it back to this idea of matrescence as a developmental framework. If we think about it in that way versus the ways that our culture kind of likes to think about passage into motherhood, where it's like, okay, you have the baby, and then after a certain amount of time, you bounce back, you come back from that experience. Um, when we look at it through the lens of matrescence, that's not the goal. The goal is that we're we're transformed by this process, and so it's not as though you reach this point where you can be so compassionate that you're choosing your child over yourself all the time. It's not a an instinct that's going to kick in. It's more something that, like adolescence, we move into a different phase of life. And so just maybe we can close with this quote from Dr. Athan, where
Mhm.
she was recently interviewed, and I loved the way she summed this up. She says, the bounce back is a cultural myth. This isn't about pressuring mothers to get their body back or returning to work and life as if nothing ever happened. There is no before, there is only forward. This is hopefully about transformation. It has the potential to change everything.
It really does. It really
It
does.
does.
I agree with that. If we can help people in their development through this period of time into whatever it's going to look like as they move through it, it's better for everyone. It's better for mom, baby, family, dad, partner, everyone. I really,
Everyone.
really appreciate that perspective.
And to realize that we're in a very long game here. So the sprinting has to stop because this
Yes.
is a marathon.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for bringing this in. It's been on my mind and as a frustration on my end with the parents that I meet with. So having this discussion, having your perspective in here is so helpful, I know, to people who are listening. So thank you.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm just so happy to be back, and great discussion. We could probably talk all day about this.
100%. Yeah.
Thank you.
You can learn more about Christine at thefamilyflow.com and connect with her school, carrigmontessori.com. I'm going to have a link for you in the show notes to the link that she mentioned, and that will be to insider.com. And if you haven't yet checked out the new series within the Mom and Mind podcast called Behind the Sessions, please do check that out. Every other Thursday, I will be releasing new episodes where I talk about things that come up in therapy and things that are therapy related, some specifically to perinatal mental health. But you would be surprised to understand and know just how many things are connected in terms of therapy and issues that people have to this reproductive period of time, to perinatal mental health that are also kind of general type of therapy issues, but they take on a new light during this time. And I'm happy to dig into all of it, really to break the stigma, to make sure that everybody knows that, hey, we are all going through stuff. And if you are there feeling alone, feeling like you don't understand what's going on for you, I'm going to talk about it. I'm going to talk about the stuff that comes up in therapy. So, yeah, go check that out. You don't have to do anything differently. The episodes are in the same place you already listened to the Mom and Mind podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. Until next time.